The wind carried dust across the broken fields, bending the tall grass until it almost lay flat, as if the land itself bowed beneath the weight of summer. In that lonely stretch of prairie, where the sky stretched too wide and too empty for comfort, a young woman named Eliza Harper carried a secret inside her chest. She was planning to leave, and she knew it might cost her everything. Eliza had grown up in a house that never once felt like a home. To strangers, the Harper household appeared respectable, a tall, weathered farmhouse with a porch that creaked beneath the weight of years, cattle lowing in the distance, and a father whose stern voice could be heard across the fields. But within its walls, shadows fell longer than they should have, and cruelty lingered like the bitter aftertaste of medicine. Her stepmother, Ruth, carried a sharpness in her voice that cut deeper than any whip. Her father, once kind in her earliest memories, had long since turned into a hard, silent man who allowed Ruth's words to rule the house. Every day blurred into the same routine: wake before dawn, carry water from the well, cook meals she would never be allowed to sit and enjoy, wash clothes until her hands were raw, then tend to animals while her brothers, Ruth's sons, sat idly by. If Eliza faltered, even for a moment, she was reminded of her place, not through blows, though those had come too, but through the kind of words that hollowed a soul, words meant to convince her she was worth less than the dirt clinging to her boots. "You'll never leave this place," Ruth had told her one evening, her lips curling with disdain as she handed Eliza a basket too heavy for her arms. "Girls like you wouldn't last a day out there. Be grateful you've got a roof, or you'd be eaten alive." But Eliza was no longer afraid of the world beyond. What frightened her more was the thought of staying. Each passing year she felt her spirit shrinking, caged behind chores and scorn, until she realized the only way to survive was to run. She had no map, no allies, no clear destination. All she had was a single bag tucked beneath the loose board under her bed, a threadbare shawl, a tin cup, a small loaf of bread she had stolen from the pantry, and a knife with a handle worn smooth from her father's hand before he stopped caring to pass such things down. On the night she decided to leave, the house was hushed, except for the sigh of wind pressing against the shutters. The moon spilled silver light across the yard, outlining the barn, the corral, and the long road that vanished into darkness. Eliza lay awake, listening to the heavy breathing of her brothers down the hall and the faint rattle of Ruth's snores through the thin walls. Her heart pounded as though it knew she was about to sever herself from everything familiar, even the pain she had known all her life. She waited until the clock downstairs struck midnight. Slowly, carefully, she lifted the loose board and retrieved her bag. Every creak of the floor seemed to scream in the silence, but no one stirred. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, held her breath, and pushed open the window. The night air rushed in, cool against her face, carrying the scent of dust and the faint sweetness of prairie sage. Her bare feet touched the ground, and for a moment she simply stood there, trembling. She was free, if only for a heartbeat. Free in a way she had never felt. But freedom in the West was never simple. By dawn, exhaustion gnawed at her, but she pressed forward. She followed the faint track left by wagons, though she didn't know where it would lead. With every mile, her fear grew. Wolves, men with crueler intentions than Ruth, hunger, thirst. Yet beneath all that fear lived a spark of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The second night, rain came without warning. It poured down in sheets, drenching her shawl, soaking her bag until the bread crumbled into useless paste. She found shelter beneath an outcropping of rock. shivering as lightning tore the sky apart. She pressed her knees to her chest, whispering to herself that she had chosen this, that the storm was better than Ruth's voice. The thunder was kinder than the silence of her father. But storms end, and when dawn returned, so did her resolve. On the third day, her strength faltered. Hunger twisted her stomach, her lips cracked with thirst, and the road stretched endless before her. She stumbled once, catching herself on bleeding palms, and thought perhaps Ruth had been right. She might not last a day. But when she lifted her head, she saw something she had never seen before. A cluster of wildflowers growing defiantly in the dust, bright yellow faces turned toward the sun. They were fragile, out of place, yet alive. Eliza forced herself up. She kept walking. By the time the sun sank again, painting the horizon in bands of fire and violet, she saw smoke in the distance. Not the thin smoke of prairie fire, but the curling gray that rose from a chimney. Her legs nearly gave out. A homestead, maybe kind hands, maybe danger. She had no way of knowing. Her steps carried her forward anyway. She could not turn back. The house she found was smaller than her father's, but it looked cared for. The porch was swept, the windows patched against the wind, the barn sturdy. A horse lifted its head as she approached, snorting softly. Eliza hesitated at the gate, her body trembling with fatigue and fear. The door opened before she could decide. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. His shirt was plain, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hands rough from work. He looked at her without a word, eyes narrowing just slightly, not with cruelty, but with the caution of someone who had lived long in a land that gave little for free. Eliza swallowed hard. "Please," she managed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I need water." For a moment, the silence between them stretched, heavy as stone. Then the man gave a single nod and disappeared inside. When he returned, he held out a tin cup, filled to the brim. Eliza drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, too desperate to care. When she lowered the cup, the man's gaze met hers again, steady and unreadable. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask why she was there, standing at his gate, with nothing but a soaked shawl and hollow eyes. He simply said, in a voice quiet but firm, "You'd better come inside. Night falls quick out here." Eliza's heart pounded as she stepped across the threshold of a stranger's home, not knowing if she was walking into salvation or another kind of prison. But something in the way he had handed her that cup, without question or judgment, made her believe for the first time that she might have a chance to fight for a new life. And so the girl who had fled the cruelty of her own blood took her first step into the unknown, where every choice ahead could either save her or destroy her.
The first night on the road was a lesson in both freedom and fear. For years, Eliza had dreamed of escape, but dreams were softer than the reality of cold earth beneath her back and the haunting silence of a world she had never walked alone. She pressed her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders as the prairie wind howled like a wild animal, carrying with it the scent of rain and dust. Every sound seemed larger than it was: the snapping of a twig, the flutter of wings, the distant cry of a coyote that felt close enough to steal the last of her courage. Yet even as her heart beat violently against her ribs, there was a stubborn flame inside her, the very one that had made her gather her few belongings and walk away from the cruel voices and punishing hands that had tried to own her. That flame whispered that suffering in freedom was better than comfort in chains. She rose before dawn, stiff and aching, and began to walk again, her feet already blistering inside worn shoes, her eyes scanning the horizon where the rising sun painted the land in muted gold. By midday, her stomach twisted with hunger, and her lips cracked from thirst, but she refused to turn back. Behind her lay the house where every kindness had been a lie, every smile a mask for cruelty. Ahead was uncertainty, but also the possibility of a life that belonged to her alone. The road was not kind. Dust clung to her skin. Thorns tore her dress, and the heat pressed down like a heavy hand. But with each step, Eliza felt the strange sense of power blooming in her chest. She was fragile, yes, but she was no longer under anyone's command. She drank from a shallow stream, crouching low as if the water itself might vanish if she moved too quickly. And for the first time in years, she whispered a prayer, not to be saved, but to stay strong enough to save herself. The days blurred together in a rhythm of walking, resting, and surviving. Sometimes she caught sight of distant riders, their silhouettes sharp against the horizon, and she would slip into tall grass, holding her breath until they vanished. She had nothing worth stealing, but she knew the world was not kind to a woman traveling alone. Nights were colder than she imagined, her body curling into itself to hold on to whatever warmth she could muster. And often she woke in a panic from dreams that carried her back into the old house, the sting of insults ringing in her ears. Each time she shook herself awake, reminding herself that those chains were gone, and the only master she answered to now was the hunger in her belly and the ache in her legs. By the fifth day, exhaustion painted her movements slow. But there was a wildness in her eyes, something fierce and unyielding that no household of cruelty had managed to break. She walked with a limp where a blister had split open, blood drying inside her shoe, yet her lips curled into something dangerously close to a smile, because for the first time she realized she would rather bleed in freedom than live untouched in captivity.
It was on the sixth night, as the moon climbed high and the stars scattered across the sky like spilled silver, that Eliza stumbled upon the flickering glow of a campfire. She froze, her heart clawing its way into her throat. Fire meant people, and people meant risk. She crouched low, peering through the brush until she could make out the outline of a lone traveler, a man seated on a log, sharpening a knife in the firelight. His face was half hidden in the shadows, but his movements were steady, unhurried, like someone who had spent years under the open sky. Eliza's first instinct was to flee, to melt back into the darkness and keep her distance, but the gnawing hunger inside her pushed her toward the glow. Her legs trembled as she stepped into the circle of light, her voice breaking when she forced out a single word. "Please." The man's head lifted, his hand pausing over the blade, and in his eyes there was neither surprise nor malice, only a quiet recognition of what it meant to be lost and desperate. He offered her no questions, only a piece of bread from his satchel and a space near the fire. Eliza ate slowly, as if each bite might vanish before she swallowed, and when she finished, she expected him to demand something in return. Instead, he simply nodded at the flames and said, "Cold night." That simple mercy broke something inside her. For years she had been treated as though her very existence was a debt she could never repay, yet here was a stranger who gave without asking. She told him nothing of her past, only that she was traveling, and he did not press her. The silence between them was not heavy, but gentle, like a blanket laid over wounds. That night, she slept near the fire, her body finally unclenching in the presence of someone who did not demand, threaten, or command. When she woke, the man was already saddling his horse, and before she could thank him properly, he pressed a water flask into her hands. "Keep moving," he said simply, his voice rough but not unkind. She watched him ride away until the dust swallowed his silhouette, and for a moment, she felt both abandoned and blessed. He had not offered to save her, but he had reminded her that she was capable of saving herself. With renewed strength,
Eliza pressed onward, her eyes no longer fixed on the ground, but on the wide horizon ahead. The road was still long, the dangers real, but the seed of something new had taken root inside her, something stubborn, something alive. She walked not as a girl fleeing cruelty, but as a woman carving her way into a life that was hers. And though the world was vast and uncertain, she had already begun to fight for her place within it.
The dawn broke over the settlement like a reluctant confession, pale light seeping across the rooftops of weather-worn cabins and smoke curling from crooked chimneys. For Elena, it was the first sunrise in years that did not feel like a cage. The rough blanket still carried the faint smell of another woman's hands who had sewn it. The stale but warm scent of bread filled the hut, and the crackling fire held a promise she had never dared to imagine: safety. Yet safety was fragile here, like a bird caught between a hunter's arrow and open skies. She rose quietly, smoothing her hair with nervous hands, and stepped out into the muddy yard where villagers were already moving about. She expected stares, whispers, suspicion. Instead, she found something far more unsettling: indifference. The butcher was cutting meat, the blacksmith hammering iron, the women drawing water. Life flowed around her as if she were no more than a shadow passing through. After years of being told she was nothing, it felt both terrifying and liberating to be treated as ordinary. But ordinariness could not erase fear. Every creak of a wagon wheel behind her made her flinch. Every man's voice in the distance reminded her of shouts she had once endured. Still, Elena knew she could not remain cowering in the corners of another family's kindness. If she was to stay here, if she was to earn her place, she needed to find something, some work, some act that would prove she belonged. The chance came sooner than expected. By mid-morning, the quiet hum of routine shattered. Shouts rose near the edge of the settlement, frantic and sharp, carrying the kind of terror no one mistook. Elena followed the sound, her feet dragging though her heart compelled her forward. There, just beyond the cluster of huts, she saw a horse thrashing violently, its reins tangled in a wooden cart. A boy of no more than 10 was caught beneath the wheel, his small body pinned, his cries piercing through the chaos. The villagers froze. Some shouted instructions, others moved forward only to recoil at the danger. The horse's eyes were rolling white with panic, its hooves striking dangerously close to the trapped child. Fear bound them all in place, but something within Elena snapped free. She did not think of the bruises once given to her for stepping out of line, nor of the punishments for daring to raise her voice. She thought only of the boy's face, twisted in terror, and of her own childhood self who had once wished someone, anyone, would come to her rescue. Without pause, she surged forward. Her bare hands gripped the reins with a strength born of desperation, yanking hard against the beast's frenzy. The leather cut into her skin, but she pulled with every ounce of will. The horse reared, hot breath steaming against her cheek, and for a moment it seemed she would be crushed beneath its hooves. But she held on. She planted her feet in the mud, heart pounding like war drums, and screamed, a sound not of fear but of defiance, a raw, primal cry that startled even the panicked animal. The horse jerked back, stumbling just enough for 2 men to rush forward and drag the boy free. The wheel splintered as the cart tipped, and the horse broke away, galloping into the open field. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Elena collapsed to her knees, breathless, her palms raw and bleeding. She expected rebuke, perhaps laughter or dismissal, but when she lifted her head, she saw the villagers staring at her with something she had never seen directed toward her before: respect. The boy's mother rushed to her son, tears streaking down her face as she clutched him close. Then she turned to Elena. "You saved him," she whispered, as though afraid the words might vanish if spoken too loud. Elena wanted to protest, to say it was nothing, that anyone would have done the same. But deep inside she knew that was not true. For years she had been silent. Today she had chosen to act. That night, as the village gathered in the communal hall, Elena sat by the fire, her hands bandaged, her body still trembling from exhaustion. But there was something new in the air around her, an opening, a shift. People approached her not with suspicion, but with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? Could she work with the seamstresses, or help fetch water from the river? Their voices were cautious, but there was no cruelty in them. For the first time in her life, she was being seen not just as property, not as a burden, but a woman who had something to offer. Still, when she closed her eyes that night, sleep did not come easily. Her past lingered like a shadow, whispering that this peace could not last. But in her chest, a small, fragile flame burned. It was not yet triumph, not yet freedom, but it was hope. And hope was something no one had ever allowed her to keep. The following days unfolded like a test she had never studied for. The village, while grateful, was not gentle. The women set her to work hauling water buckets until her arms ached, mending clothes with pricked fingers until they bled, scrubbing floors until her back screamed in protest. Each night she returned to the small cot offered to her and collapsed, too weary to dream. Yet with each task she felt a strange kind of pride bloom within her. The bruises she carried now were not from cruelty, but from labor. The pain was hers to bear, chosen, and in that choice there was power. One evening, after a long day spent mending nets with the fishermen by the river, she lingered on the bank long after the others had left. The water reflected the fading light of dusk, trembling with the soft breeze, and for the first time she dared to let herself imagine a future where she could earn her own keep, carve her own place, perhaps even laugh without fear of punishment. It seemed impossible, and yet, hadn't she already survived the impossible? The thought barely had time to settle when the sound of hooves approached. Her body stiffened, instinct screaming. A lone rider appeared, silhouetted against the horizon, his figure rigid, his face unreadable in the fading light. Elena's heart pounded. For a moment she feared her past had caught up with her, that someone had come to drag her back to the cruel household she had fled. But as the rider dismounted and approached, she realized his clothes bore the dust of long travel, his eyes tired yet curious. "You," he said softly, tilting his head as though searching for a memory. "You're the woman who pulled that boy from death, aren't you?" She opened her mouth to answer, but found no words. She had grown so used to silence that speech felt foreign. Yet under his gaze, steady and unyielding, she managed a nod. The man studied her for a moment, then offered something unexpected, a smile. Not a mocking curl of lips, not a smirk meant to belittle, but a genuine, weary smile. "The settlement needs more people like you, people with courage, people who know how to fight for life." Fight. The word hung between them like a prophecy. Elena did not yet know where it would lead, nor what storms lay ahead. But as the evening settled around them, she realized that for the first time in her life, someone had not seen her broken, but as strong. And that, perhaps, was the beginning of everything she had been running toward.
The day the caravan turned toward Santa Fe, a subtle tension filled the air. The dry wind lifted the edges of Isabella's shawl, carrying with it the scent of dust and sagebrush, and somewhere in the far distance, a hawk circled slowly above the canyon rim. She had learned to ride long stretches without complaint, to keep her back straight and her eyes steady, even when her muscles burned and her stomach clenched from hunger. These weeks on the trail had reshaped her, carving away the fragility of a housebound girl and hardening her into someone who could endure blistering days and frigid nights. Yet in her chest, the same fragile pulse of fear lingered. Fear of being pursued, of being recognized, of the life she left still clawing its way back to claim her. She stole glances at Elias as they rode side by side, his hat shadowing his sharp profile, the reins slack in his confident hands. He did not speak much, but his silence had grown familiar to her, almost a kind of shield she could lean against. The others in the caravan, traders, travelers, wanderers like herself, sometimes teased her, sometimes ignored her, but Elias watched without judgment, a sentinel who let her find her own footing. And slowly she had begun to believe that perhaps for the first time her fate rested in her own hands. The land shifted as they pushed northward. Red stone buttes rose like ancient cathedrals, casting long shadows across the valley. At night, when the fires burned low, Isabella would lie awake staring at the stars, their icy brilliance more numerous than any candlelit ceiling she had ever seen. Once, she whispered to Elias, asking how it was possible that the sky could hold so many lights. He had paused, then told her softly, "They've always been there. You just had to leave the walls to see them." That answer, simple as it was, lodged deep in her soul. But the trail was never safe. One evening, as dusk fell, the caravan came upon a creekside clearing where the grass grew thick and the water trickled silver under the moon. The wagons formed a circle, fires crackled, and laughter briefly filled the air. Isabella found herself for the first time laughing too, awkward, hesitant, but real. A trader's wife handed her a tin cup of coffee, and for a moment Isabella let herself imagine that this rough company was a kind of family. It was only when the howls cut through the night that she remembered how fragile everything was. Coyotes at first, distant, eerie. But then from the ridge, shadows moved. Elias stiffened. The men reached for rifles. Isabella's heart hammered as a figure appeared against the fading firelight. Not animal, but man. Then another. Then more slipping between the boulders, circling like wolves. Raiders. The trail's silent menace made flesh. "Stay by the fire," Elias commanded, his voice low, steady, before he moved to the edge of the circle. The others shouted, guns were cocked, the air thickened with the smell of powder and fear. Isabella's hands trembled around the tin cup. She was back in her father's house, powerless, a girl whose voice had no weight, except this time there was no locked door, no familiar walls to hold her, only the open night, wide and merciless. The raiders advanced. A shot rang out, echoing across the canyon. Horses screamed, men cursed. Isabella pressed herself behind a barrel, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She glimpsed Elias firing once, twice, his silhouette lit by the firelight, unwavering. She wanted to cry out, to beg him not to risk himself, but the words froze in her throat. The skirmish lasted minutes, but it felt like eternity. In the end, the raiders scattered, leaving only silence broken by the panting of horses and the crackle of flames. One of the traders lay wounded, blood dark against a sleeve, but alive. Elias lowered his rifle slowly, scanning the darkness until he was certain they were alone again. Isabella emerged, shaken, her legs unsteady. The camp buzzed with nervous voices, men counting bullets, women whispering prayers. But she went straight to Elias. His shirt clung damp with sweat, soot smeared his hands, yet his eyes were calm, as though danger was nothing but a passing storm. "You could have been killed," she whispered. His gaze softened. "So could we all. That's the way of the trail." But she shook her head, her voice rising, the weight of years pressing into it. "No, that's not the way it should be. People shouldn't have to live waiting for the next blow, the next cruelty." For the first time, Elias looked at her, not just as a girl surviving the road, but as someone carrying a wound deeper than any he could see. In the flicker of firelight, something unspoken passed between them, something neither of them yet had the courage to name. That night,
Isabella did not sleep. She sat watching the horizon, her shawl pulled tight, her thoughts circling like restless horses. Fear still lived inside her, but alongside it, a spark of something else, a defiance, a resolve that she would not go back, not ever. If danger awaited ahead, she would meet it standing, not cowering. For she had escaped once, and she would never again surrender the fragile, hard-won taste of freedom.
The sun was barely climbing over the horizon when Eliza stepped outside her cabin, a thin mist curling above the fields like the last breath of a fading dream. Her hands, calloused but steady, gripped a tin cup of coffee, and for a long moment she just stood in silence, listening to the sparrows call from the cottonwood branches, the distant lowing of cattle drifting from beyond the ridge. This was her land now. Not a grand house, not a vast inheritance stolen from her like so many before, but a patch of earth she had worked with her own hands, soil turned beneath her fingernails, fences mended by lantern light, seeds planted in hope. Every morning she felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a strange kind of blessing carved out of pain. Her thoughts wandered back, as they often did, to the night she had run, barefoot, beaten, breathless through the darkness, not knowing whether the world beyond the cruel household would welcome her or devour her whole. She remembered the hunger that gnawed at her bones, the nights when cold winds clawed through her thin shawl, the faces of strangers who either turned away or stared with suspicion. Yet somehow she had made it here. Somehow she had wrestled life out of a wilderness of despair. And now, when she pressed her palm to the wooden door of her small cabin, she could almost feel it pulse like a heartbeat, her own heart, steady and unbroken. The townsfolk had come to know her, not as the desperate girl who stumbled into their lives, but as Eliza, the woman who fought like a storm to carve her place in the valley. She helped neighbors during harvest, stitched quilts for widows, and watched their children when sickness swept through. They saw in her eyes a fire that refused to die, and though whispers of her past floated now and again, they mattered less with each passing season. She no longer flinched when someone asked about her family. Instead, she answered with a gentle strength, "I built what I needed with my own 2 hands." That morning, as she sipped her coffee, she heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Turning, she saw Thomas approaching, hat in hand, his figure framed by the light breaking over the hills. He had been a steady presence in her story, never pressing, never prying, simply standing at her side when the storms came. When her barn roof caved in during the winter snow, he had been there with hammer and nails. When sickness bent her low, he rode for medicine in the night. And when her memories clawed at her like shadows, he sat quietly on her porch, letting silence be the salve. "Eliza," he said softly, stopping just short of the steps. "The town is holding a gathering this evening. They're dedicating the new schoolhouse. Thought you might want to come." For a heartbeat, her chest tightened. Gathering still held echoes of judgment for her, memories of being paraded, scrutinized, shamed. But she saw the warmth in his eyes, the quiet way he offered, not commanded. She nodded slowly. "Yes, I think it's time." The day unfolded in small labors, the mending of a fence post, the sweeping of her floor, the baking of bread she would bring as her offering to the schoolhouse. With each task her nerves rattled, but she pressed on, and when evening fell, she brushed her hair, tied it back with a simple ribbon, and slipped into a faded blue dress she had repaired a dozen times over. She stood before her mirror, seeing not the frightened girl who had escaped, but the woman who had survived, a woman who had earned her place among others. When she walked into town, lanterns glowed along the street, casting golden halos across faces filled with laughter and music. Children darted past with sparklers, women carried pies, men clapped each other on the back. She hesitated at the edge, her heart pounding, but then Thomas appeared at her side. Without a word, he extended his hand. She took it, and together they stepped forward. The schoolhouse stood at the center of it all. freshly painted white, its bell glinting in the last rays of twilight. Inside, benches had been set, flowers arranged, and candles flickered against the wooden walls. The mayor gave a speech about growth, about community, about hope planted like seeds that must be tended with care. As he spoke, Eliza's eyes swept over the crowd, the widowed mothers, the weary farmers, the laughing children with ink-stained fingers. She realized then that the town was not perfect, but it was hers, and she was part of it. No one could take that away. After the speech, music filled the air. A fiddle struck up a lively tune, boots stomped, and laughter spilled like river water. Thomas guided her toward the circle of dancers, but she pulled back, shaking her head. "I don't know if I remember how," she whispered. He only smiled, lifting her hand. "Then let me remind you." She stumbled at first, her feet uncertain, but as the fiddles sang on, something inside her loosened. She began to laugh, truly laugh, the sound surprising even herself. The years of pain didn't vanish, but they softened, like snow melting under spring's first warmth. Around her, the townsfolk cheered, not because she was flawless, but because she was free. She was living. As the night deepened, Eliza stepped outside for air. Stars scattered across the sky, infinite and untouchable, yet somehow close enough to whisper promises. Thomas followed, settling beside her on the steps. For a while, neither spoke. The world felt vast and silent, like a cathedral of open sky. Finally, he broke the quiet. "You've come so far, Eliza, more than anyone I've ever known." Her throat tightened. "I thought I'd never get here, that I'd always be running from shadows." "You're not running anymore. You're building," he said gently. She turned toward him, the lamplight from inside catching in his eyes. For the first time, she believed his words. She had built a home, a life, a place where her laughter could echo without fear. She had fought her way through cruelty, through hunger, through the relentless voices that told her she would never belong. And here she was, belonging. Not because someone had granted it, but because she had claimed it. Thomas reached for her hand, not with urgency, but with the patience of someone who knew the value of time. She let him take it. And under the stars, surrounded by the hum of music and the warmth of a community that had finally become her own, Eliza let herself rest. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. She was loved. The scars of her past would never fully fade. They were etched into her skin, her memory, her very soul. But instead of chains, they had become the marks of her strength, proof that she had endured, that she had fought, that she had risen. When dawn came again, it found Eliza not as a fugitive, not as a broken girl stumbling in fear, but as a woman standing tall on her own ground. A woman who had carved a new life from the wilderness of pain. A woman who had escaped a cruel household and fought her way, step by step, into freedom. And that, she knew, was only the beginning.